Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do is understand what exactly are we looking at over here. Now, when it comes to working with bones, we're going to have access to three different type of spaces that we can work with. So the first space that you already know how it works is called world space. This is according to the global coordinate system. Now, having the armature selected, make sure that you are in pose mode and switch this to a global. Now, if we just do the middle mouse button, if we move this bone according to the global coordinate system, we have to use the 3D manipulator to move this bone. So over here, when we click on the X, you'll notice that we are moving this bone on the X-axis, the Y-axis, and the Z-axis, okay? Now do Alt-G to reset the location. Now notice over here that when we click on its X value to move along the X, there are two numbers that are changing over here. We're going to understand why this is, right? Now, this is how you move a bone in world space. We're going to do Alt-G to reset its location. Now, if we want to move this bone according to its local space, meaning the axis that is being displayed on its tail, here we're going to switch to a local space. Now you'll see that when we click on this blue arrow to move along the Z, you'll see that only the Z number is changing. We can actually click this. So we are right now moving this bone in its local space. Same thing with X, and of course when we do Y, it's just going to move up and down. Do Alt-G to reset its location. Now the third way we can move this bone is according to pose space. And what pose space is space that belongs to the armature's axis, meaning that the Z and Y that is being displayed on the armature. So if we switch to object mode, you can see that this is what is called pose space. Now over here, we're going to switch to pose mode, and over here, we're going to go to our custom transforms. Now, when we click on the Y, we are right now moving this bone according to pose space. Okay, now notice that when we click on the Z over here in pose space, the Y is going to change because the bone can only move according to its local space. Okay, and when we click on Z, we're really moving along the Y-axis in pose space. And when we click on X, we're moving according to pose space along the X. So right now the bone is actually aligned according to the X-axis both in pose space and local space. This is why this is behaving this way. But if we click on the Y-axis to move along pose space on Y, we're actually moving along Z because this is what it's displaying on the tail. So do Alt-G to reset this. So what this tells you is that when it comes to bones, bones actually use their own local coordinate system. Each individual bone will use its own local coordinate system, and that is what is called local space. Okay, so world space is basically the global coordinate system, pose space is what belongs to the armature, and local space is what belongs to the bone itself. Now go ahead and switch this to a local. Okay, now we're going to understand local space first. What exactly is it? So the local coordinate system is basically decided by the bone itself in edit mode. Okay, so you can see that how we've positioned this bone. Here you can see that the Z-axis is coming towards us, the X-axis is going to the right, and the Y-axis is going up. So this is how the bone is deciding what its local coordinate system is. Now, if we do shift middle mouse button to pan over here, click on this bone and press the R key 2 times just to rotate it like this, and now switch again here to pose mode, you can see that the local coordinate system is going to again be determined how the bone's orientation is in edit mode. This is how the local coordinate system works. So each individual bone controls its local coordinate system. So I want you to go ahead and switch this to pose mode. Now, what we're going to do over here is actually click on this grid. Now just do Control A. Here we can do visual transform. When we actually fire this off, what's going to happen is going to take the constraints into account and inject those values. This allows us to actually turn off the constraints. The reason we're doing this is because it gives us the ability to click on this bone and now move it according to its local coordinate system, so the grid stays in place so we can see what's going on. Now notice that when we click on this X value, we are right now moving this bone in its local coordinate system. When we click on Z, it's going to move along Z. And of course, when we click on Y, it's going to go up and down, because this is what the local coordinate system is doing. This is what this grid is representing. So I'm going to click on this bone and do Alt-G. Now let's take a look at this bone over here. So we're going to do the same thing. Click on this. Now you can actually just go under Object, do Apply, and do Visual Transform. This is why we use Control A. Just click it. Now when you do that, you have to make sure that you actually see the numbers coming in. Now go ahead and turn both of these off. Now when we click on this bone, you'll notice that over here, if we move along the X, it will move along its local coordinate system. If we move on Z, it will move along its local Z. And of course Y, it'll just go up and down. Do Alt-G to reset this. So this is how the local coordinate system works in bounds. So this is what is a local space. Okay, now this makes a lot more sense when we click on this bone and say that, okay, we want to move this bone in world space, so we know that we have to switch the 3D manipulator to a global. So now when we click on Y, now you'll see that why these two numbers were changing, because this bone only knows how to move according to its local coordinate system, right? So if you just rotate like this, you can see that of course it's moving along the X over here, right? And of course the Z over here is pointing this way, so it's going to point the other way too, right? So this is why the Z and the X are changing. It's the same concept, but here it's just being done in local space. Now in the same way, if we switch this to pose space, which is the orientation determined by the armature itself, when we click on Y over here, you'll notice that this is why only the Z was changing, because that's the axis that belongs to the local coordinate system. So when we click on Y that belongs to pose space, this is why that is changing. Of course, X is just aligned perfectly, so X is going to work. Now when we click on the Z, it's going to change the Y on its local coordinate system. But really here in pose space, we're moving along the Z that belongs to the armature itself. Do Alt-G to reset this. Okay? Now let's go ahead and just reload the file so we can reset everything. Okay, now what I want to show you that, okay, then if we switch to edit mode and click on this bone, and if we change the roll, remember when you're changing the roll of the bone, you're really just rotating the bone along the y-axis. Over here, I want you to type in 90 and press enter. So now the Z is coming this way and the X is pointing this way. Now we have to, of course, switch to pose mode to realign this grid. Now you'll see that this axis is matching the axis that is being displayed on the tail of this bone. Of course, we have to click on this and do Control A and do Visual Transform and shut this off. Okay. Now when we click on this bone and move this blue arrow, it's going to move on the z-axis, see? And this is the x, and this is the y. Now I want you to Alt G to reset this, okay? So now we're going to go ahead and actually save this file. So do File, Save As, and save this as a bone concept 6.blend. So keep it separate. Now the question is, okay, well, how is this going to work when we are working with constraints? Now the first thing that you'll notice is that when you click on this bone and go to the Constraints tab, here it's saying that you need to go to the Bone Constraints tab. So if you click it, it'll just switch to this constraint. So this means that this constraint tab only works on the object level, meaning that if we switch this to object mode on the armature, it's going to basically work just like we've been seeing it working with objects, because the armature is the object itself. But when we switch to pose mode, now we're exclusively working with bones, so we have to go to the Bone Constraints tab. Now when you click it, you'll notice that the selections are basically the same here. Now the only difference is going to be is the way they look. So when we do copy location over here, you'll see that right now is showing the same panel that we were seeing in object mode. Now notice that the bone turns green. This tells you that a constraint is on it. Now over here we're going to click on armature. It's asking for the bone. So of course we're going to select this bone, right? Because when we have this bone selected, you can see its name, it says bone. So over here I want you to click on bone.001. As soon as you click it, you'll see that we get this special option over here. So by default, when the location is copied to the owner object, the bone will always stick to the head of the bone, right? So here, if we click this, we can actually decide, well, just stick to the tail, okay? Now, if we click over here just to make sure that on the constraints, these are not off. So what we're going to do is do Control A and actually do Visual Transform and shut these off, and actually click over here, and these should be off, okay? So what I want you to do is go ahead and click on this bone. Now notice that when we press the R key 2 times and rotate this, the bone actually stays vertical, that's on top. This is very powerful because we're going to be using this when we are building our module-based rigging system. Now when we click on this bone, go to the Constraints tab and actually do this halfway. Click on it, you'll see that it's going to behave the same way, right? And of course, if you click on it, you make it go all the way down. Now you have to click through the bone to get to bone.001. Now when you press the R key 2 times, nothing's going to happen because both locations are matching the head values, right? That's what's going on. Now go ahead and click this and now switch this to a local space and a local space, okay? Now, let's go ahead and actually save this file. So what I want you to notice over here is that when we click this, you can see that we're seeing the same thing that we just talked about. We're seeing roll space, which is based on the roll coordinate system. Pose space is what belongs to the armature, and a local space is the local coordinate system that is decided by the bone itself in edit mode, okay? So to understand this concept of how this constraint works with these spaces, we're going to leave the target object in a local space, okay? Now, what we're going to do is switch this first to world space, and we're going to see where this bone is going. So you'll see that this bone is going to end up in the center of the 3D grid because we're evaluating this in world space. So the reason this bone appears over here is because this bone is looking at the location values of this bone, right? Now this bone is showing that if you switch to edit mode, it's matching its position in pose mode. So over here, the location has even changed. This is why this bone in roll space ends up in the center, because there's no location values, they're just 0. So when we click on this bone and let's say move along the X, Now when we start to add the location values, meaning that we're moving this bone away from its original position in edit mode, that information is being fed to this bone in world space. So this is why it's moving along the X. Okay, so here if we do Z, it will go up, and of course Y, it will just go back. We're looking at this bone over here. So make sure you understand how this concept is working. It's actually pretty straightforward. Now do Alt G to reset the location. Go ahead and click this. So this is a very straightforward concept to understand when we are evaluating the owner in world space. Now I want you to switch this to pose space. Notice what's going to happen. Of course, it's going to jump to the origin point of the armature itself, because that's what pose space is. So now when we click on this bone and move along the X, you'll notice that this bone is going to move along the armature's X-axis, right? Now when we move on Y, it's going to move along the Y on the armature Y-axis, and if we move this on a Z, it's going to go up on the Z, because that's what the armature Z-axis is pointing up. So this is how this bone moves in pose space. Go ahead and click this bone, do Alt G to reset its location. Now over here, a local space is very obvious. Remember we had changed the orientation, meaning the bone roll, so the Z is pointing this way. So now if we click on this bone, click on this Z, if we move along the Z, this will move along its Z. If we move along the Y, of course it's going to go up and down, and if we move along X, it's going to move along its X. Very straightforward concept when it comes to understanding world space and local space. Again, the only reason this is even making sense is because we understood this on the object level. Okay, so now you know how this works. We're going to take a look at local with parent a little later. Okay, so now what I want you to do is keep this on local space, and we're going to now switch this to world space. Okay, go ahead and switch it. Now notice that where does this bone go if we zoom out? Now how come this bone appears over here and it seems to have moved on top? So let's take a look at what's going on. So here we're saying to the target, evaluate yourself in world space. Okay, now let's take a look at this from the top first. So if we're evaluating this in world space, and we're evaluating this in a local space, what's happening here is that if we take the grease pencil over here Blender is saying that, okay, where exactly are you along the x-axis? You're about here, right? Press the escape key. Now let's take a look at where this bone is according to its x-axis. Click over here and measure the x, right? That's where it is. That's the first thing. Now we need to take a look at, okay, how is this, where is this bone according to the world y-axis? Okay, so here we're just going to press the 7 key. Now over here, when we do this, we can see that along the y-axis is up here, right? Now because this bone itself is being it's operating in a local space, this simply means that along the y it can only move up and down. This is why it ends up on top. It's taking the y value over here and pushing itself on top. So now if we look at how far is it in world space from the 3D grid itself, meaning up and down along the z, you'll notice that over here in its a local space, if we press the 7 key, you'll notice that it along the z it actually moved to the right. That's how this works. Okay, so that's how this idea between world and local space works. So we're going to go file and save, and I'll see you in the next lesson. Thank you.